June 14th, 2017, 12:54 a.m. A kitchen appliance fire in flat 16 of Grenfell Tower should have been contained by concrete walls. Instead, flames race up the exterior cladding at 4 meters per minute, faster than firefighters can climb the stairs. The material? Aluminum composite panels with a polyethylene core, the same configuration that caused fires in Dubai, Melbourne, and Shanghai. The same panels Germany banned on buildings over 22 meters high since the 1980s. UK regulators knew. They approved them anyway. 72 people died because someone saved £2 per square meter. The refrigerator that started everything was a Hotpoint model FF175BP. Nothing unusual. A faulty electrical component, the kind of minor failure that happens in kitchens across Britain every week. In a properly constructed building, the fire should have stayed contained. Grenfell Tower was built in 1974 with robust concrete construction. Each flat was designed as a separate fire compartment. Thick concrete floors, concrete walls. The original design philosophy was simple. If fire breaks out, it stays in one flat, while residents shelter in place. But the tower had been refurbished. Between 2015 and 2016, £8.7 million were spent modernising the building. New windows, new cladding to improve thermal efficiency and appearance. The cladding system wrapped the entire building in what fire safety experts would later describe as solid gasoline. Meanwhile, residents slept. 120 flats, 227 bedrooms, families, elderly residents, children. They had no idea the walls around them had been transformed into a vertical highway for fire. The flames escaped flat 16 at 12:59 a.m. 5 minutes after ignition. They didn't spread through the building the way fires normally do, through doors, through corridors, consuming one flat after another. Instead, they went outside. The fire hit the polyethylene core of the cladding panels and found unlimited fuel. Polyethylene burns with a heat output of 125 megajoules per square meter. That's equivalent to burning diesel fuel. The aluminum facing sheets, just 0.5 millimeters thick, melted at 660 degrees Celsius. Once they failed, nothing protected the plastic core underneath. By 1:03 a.m., flames were climbing the north face of the building. Not slowly, not gradually, at a rate that shocked even experienced firefighters watching from below. 4 meters per minute. Vertical fire spread that violated every assumption about how buildings burn. But then, this wasn't a normal fire. The cladding system created a chimney effect. A ventilated cavity between the insulation and the cladding acted as a flue, pulling flames upward with terrifying speed. Fire barriers designed to prevent this exact scenario were either missing, improperly installed, or burned through within minutes. If you're finding this level of detail valuable, subscribe. These failures shouldn't be forgotten. Throughout the tower, residents faced impossible choices. On the 14th floor, in flat 113, people dangled knotted bedsheets from windows. The makeshift rope didn't reach the ground, not even close. Over 100 feet down, bystanders shouted up, "Stay in your flat! Help is coming!" Some residents believed them. Others didn't. 4 people escaped from that flat. 4 didn't make it. Firefighters arriving at the scene saw something beyond their training, beyond their worst nightmares. Pete Wolfenden, a fire brigade officer, later described watching his colleagues. They went up fresh-faced. Coming down, they looked drained and like they'd been shot. A firefighter collapsed. Some occupants were getting carried down. The crews were covered in so much soot that colleagues couldn't recognize them. One crew climbed to the 20th floor, searching for a 12-year-old girl. They couldn't find her. She had moved to a different flat on the 23rd floor seeking safety. The firefighters had no way to know this. The girl died there. Another crew reached the 14th floor expecting 1 resident. They found 8 people. 4 eventually escaped. Meanwhile, residents throughout the building were switching lights on and off, waving from windows, holding up children, trying to signal for help. Some were heard screaming from all sides of the tower. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing people jumping. 4 victims were later determined to have died from injuries consistent with falling from a height. They chose to jump rather than burn. That choice, that impossible, horrific choice, tells you everything about what was happening inside that building. The polyethylene didn't just burn, it melted. Burning droplets fell down the building, igniting cladding panels below. This created something fire investigators had never seen in the UK. Simultaneous upward and downward fire spread on a residential tower. Meanwhile, the architectural crown at the top of the building, an aesthetic feature added during the refurbishment, acted as a horizontal bridge for flames. The fire reached the roof at 1:26 a.m., 32 minutes after it started. A 24-story building fully engulfed in less than half an hour. Inside the tower, residents were following the stay-put policy. This was standard procedure for UK high-rises. Each flat was supposed to be a safe haven, protected by fire-resistant construction. The London Fire Brigade's advice was clear. If there's a fire elsewhere in the building, stay in your flat, close your door, wait for firefighters. This policy had worked for decades in properly built towers, but Grenfell's cladding had bypassed every safety assumption the policy relied on. Fire wasn't spreading flat to flat through the building. It was racing up the outside, then burning back in through windows. On the 23rd floor, the highest residential floor in the tower, Farhad Neda had arrived home just 2 minutes before the fire started. The 24-year-old lived with his mother Flora, 55, who had mobility issues from polio, and his father Mohammed Sabir Neda, 57, a former Afghan army officer who worked as a chauffeur. The family had fled the Taliban in 1998 and found refuge in Britain. For 20 years, Grenfell Tower had been their home. When the smoke alarm in their hallway began whirring loudly, they called the building management. An engineer was on the way, they were told. Meanwhile, flames were already climbing toward them at 4 meters per minute. Other residents from lower floors came up, seeking safety from the smoke below. 4 women joined the Neda family in their flat. Mother and daughter Mariam and Esla El-Gwahri, and sisters Fatima and Sakina Afrasiabi. Like many disabled residents that night, Sakina couldn't evacuate on her own. They all believed firefighters would rescue them. Some thought helicopters might land on the roof. But the fire reached the 23rd floor first. Flames broke into a bedroom, then spread. Farhad watched his mother standing on the windowsill, saying she was ready to jump rather than burn alive. At 2:30 a.m., they decided they had to try escaping. His father Saber said he would help the others prepare, then follow right behind. That was the last time Farhad saw his father alive. The journey down was a nightmare. Farhad lifted his mother onto his back. She could walk a few floors, but for most of the descent, he carried her full weight through pitch-black smoke, so thick he couldn't see. The stairwell was filled with toxic fumes. They tripped over objects on the stairs. Bodies. People who had collapsed trying to escape. We were stepping and tripping over dead bodies, Farhad later testified. I can still hear the sounds of people desperately struggling to breathe. It sounded like they were snoring, as they choked for their last remaining gasps of air. His mother asked what they were stepping on. He lied, told her they were fire hoses. He didn't want to upset her with the truth. Halfway down, on one of the landings, they found a pocket of cleaner air. Farhad paused to catch his breath. His lungs were burning, his legs shaking, but he thought of his fiancée, his mother. He kept going. They didn't see a single firefighter until they reached the 5th floor. By that point, they had descended 18 floors through conditions no human should survive. The firefighters helped them down the final flights. Outside, both were immediately taken to hospital and placed in induced comas. Farhad spent a week unconscious. His mother Flora spent 3 weeks. The toxic smoke had destroyed their lungs. Years later, Farhad would be diagnosed with emphysema from that night. They were the only 2 people to survive from the 23rd floor. Of the 20-plus residents trapped on that highest level, only Farhad and Flora made it out. Meanwhile, Saber Neda stayed behind. He helped the 4 women in the flat, preparing them for an evacuation that would never come. When he realized he wouldn't survive, when flames filled the flat and smoke made breathing impossible, he did something remarkable. He left a voicemail message for his family. His final words: "Goodbye. I am leaving this world. Goodbye. I hope you forgive me. Goodbye, everyone." Then Mohammed Saber Neda jumped from the 23rd floor. He wanted to make sure, according to Islamic custom, his family would have his body to bury. His son would later say his father was his best friend, a man of deep integrity who loved life and always looked to help others. He died trying to save people he'd known as neighbors. The first 999 call came at 12:54 a.m. The caller reported smoke and flames coming from a 4th floor flat. By 1:07 a.m., the fire had already spread to the 18th floor. 13 minutes, 14 floors. The incident commander initially maintained the stay-put advice. He had no way of knowing the external cladding was spreading fire faster than any British high-rise fire in history. Meanwhile, residents in flats throughout the building were calling for help. The phone lines were overwhelmed. People trapped in smoke-filled flats, unable to see, unable to breathe, waiting for rescue that couldn't reach them. But here's what makes this tragedy even worse. It was entirely predictable. The materials used on Grenfell Tower were known to be dangerous. Not suspected. Not theoretically risky. Definitively proven to cause exactly this type of catastrophic fire spread. Germany had banned polyethylene core ACM panels on buildings over 22 meters high since the 1980s. France followed with similar restrictions. The United States had effectively prohibited them on high-rises through stringent fire testing requirements since 2012. UK manufacturers of the cladding knew the risks. Internal emails from Arconic, the company that made the Reynobond PE panels used on Grenfell, showed employees discussing the dangers as early as 2007. Gerard Sontag, a marketing manager, attended a presentation in Norway that year. The consultant presenting warned that 5,000 square meters of polyethylene cord ACM, roughly the amount on a single large tower, was equivalent to adding a 19,000-litre oil tanker to the building's walls. Sontag's notes recorded the warning. A person can die from the smoke emissions within 2 or 3 minutes. 2 years later, in July 2009, a fire in an office building in Bucharest ignited ACM cladding and sent flames streaking up the exterior. Claude Well, a senior technical team member at Arconic, forwarded images of the burning building to colleagues, including the company president. His message was blunt. This demonstrates the dangers of polyethylene cord panels. Verl had been pushing internally for years to switch to fire-retardant products. His warnings were ignored. In 2014, fires in Dubai's Marina Torch and other towers showed the same pattern. Rapid vertical fire spread on facades clad with combustible materials. Richard Geeta, a salesperson for Arconic's competitor 3A Composites, wrote to clients warning about polyethylene core ACM. His email described it as a chimney which transports the fire from bottom to top within shortest time. He added that some fire-retardant products claiming to be safe were fraudulent. We have taken random samples and done a live test in Bangkok in front of architects. They almost fainted. These warnings reached UK building professionals. The email was forwarded to Deborah French, Arconic's UK sales manager, who passed it to her superiors. Meanwhile, British regulatory authorities had their own warning signs. The Lakanal House fire in Camberwell, South London, in 2009 killed 6 people. The coroner's inquest identified multiple failures in fire safety, including concerns about external cladding and the adequacy of building regulations. The coroner recommended an urgent review of Approved Document B, the key fire safety guidance for building regulations. The government's response? They commissioned reviews, formed working groups, published reports, then did nothing substantive for 8 years. The same regulations that allowed combustible cladding on high-rises remained in place. The same loopholes that let manufacturers and contractors use the cheapest materials stayed open, and the same flawed understanding of how these systems actually performed in fires continued to guide decision-making. Now, the Grenfell refurbishment itself reveals how cost drove every decision. The original contractor, Leadbitter, bid £11.278 million for the work. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea considered this too expensive. They put the contract out for competitive tender. Ryden won with a bid of £8.7 million, 2.5 million less than Leadbitter's quote. The pressure to cut costs flowed through every aspect of the project. The cladding choice exemplified this cost-cutting mentality. Arconic's Reynobond came in 3 versions. Reynobond R2 had a non-combustible mineral core, safe for any building height, but expensive. Reynobond FR had a fire-retardant core mixing polyethylene with mineral filler, better than standard polyethylene, suitable for buildings up to 30 meters, moderately expensive. Reynobond PE had a 100% polyethylene core, highly combustible, recommended by the manufacturer only for buildings under 10 meters, but cheap. The price difference. £2 per square metre between Rainabond PE and Rainabond FR. £2. The total additional cost to use the fire retardant version would have been approximately £5,000 for the entire tower. Instead, they chose PE. Deborah French, Arconic's UK sales manager, would later testify that her company sold the PE version as default, because the FR version cost €4 to €5 more per square metre and was less likely to secure contracts on price. She admitted knowing the polyethylene core was and is flammable, but she never discussed combustibility with clients. She said, "These conversations about fire were just not something that ever happened." When asked if she informed buyers that the product was flammable, she claimed it would have been obvious. Meanwhile, she had been telling clients that Rainabond PE achieved a Class 0 surface rating, a certification for flame spread resistance. This was misleading. The panels had never actually been tested for Class 0 certification. The architect, Studio E, initially preferred zinc cladding for aesthetic reasons. However, zinc didn't meet the cost parameters. CEP, Architectural Facades, the firm that fabricated the panels, promoted Rainabond as a cheaper alternative. Geoff Blades, senior sales manager at CEP, later claimed he didn't know a fire retardant version existed. But inquiry lawyers presented a 2013 email where Blades explicitly discussed Rainabond FR with a competitor who explained why their own FR product was superior. Blades admitted under questioning, possibly, yes, he knew about the fire retardant version but simply hadn't specified it. You might wonder, wasn't this illegal? Actually, no. Not technically. British building regulations required that insulation and filler materials in high-rise external walls be of limited combustibility. But ACM panels weren't classified as insulation. They provided no thermal insulation properties, and filler wasn't clearly defined in the regulations. This created a loophole. Manufacturers and contractors argued the panels weren't covered by the combustibility requirements. Regulators had failed to close this obvious gap despite years of warnings. The result was a building that looked modern and attractive from outside while being fundamentally unsafe. The refurbishment added approximately 3,000 square meters of Rainabond PE panels. Behind them, 150mm thick sheets of Celotex RS 5000 insulation. Celotex used polyisocyanurate foam, another combustible plastic that will burn if exposed to fire of sufficient heat and intensity, according to its own datasheet. Police investigators later concluded this insulation was more flammable than the cladding. On top of that, gaps around the newly installed windows were filled with combustible foam to maintain airtightness. This created a continuous path for fire to enter the ventilated cavity behind the cladding. Cavity barriers that should have prevented vertical fire spread were either missing, incorrectly installed, or made of materials that failed within minutes. The entire system was a cascading failure of fire safety. At 1:43 a.m., 72 minutes after the initial call, the London Fire Brigade changed their advice. The stay-put policy was abandoned. Residents were told to evacuate if they could, but by this point, many couldn't. Smoke had filled stairwells. Flames blocked escape routes. People were trapped. The inquiry would later conclude that if the evacuation order had been given earlier, at 1:26 a.m., when the fire reached the roof, more lives could have been saved. In the chaos of evacuation, families were torn apart. 5-year-old Isaac Paulos fled with his family from their flat on the 18th floor. Somewhere in the pitch-black, smoke-filled stairwell, he became separated from them. His parents made it out. Isaac didn't. His small body was found later. A child lost in darkness and smoke, trying to find his way to safety. The stairwell became a corridor of death. Survivors who made it down described stepping over bodies of people who had collapsed. Some were already dead. Others were in their final moments, making sounds described as snoring, choking gasps for air that would never come. The smoke was so thick that visibility was zero. People felt their way down by touch, hands against walls, feet finding each step by feel alone. Firefighters performed extraordinary acts of heroism. They climbed smoke-filled stairwells carrying heavy equipment. They reached flats on upper floors and led residents to safety. They went back in repeatedly, knowing the building might collapse. But they were fighting an impossible situation. The building's design assumptions had been fundamentally violated. Nothing in their training or equipment could overcome the reality of a tower wrapped in combustible material. The psychological toll was staggering. Around 80 firefighters and Metropolitan Police officers suffered trauma from what they witnessed. London Fire Brigade Commissioner Danny Cotton, who defended her firefighters' heroism, admitted she herself needed counselling. The brigade brought in 60 volunteer counsellors. All firefighters who attended Grenfell received psychological health checks. Within 6 weeks of the fire, at least 20 suicide attempts were reported in North Kensington. One was completed. Survivors fled with nothing but pajamas. Some escaped without shoes. Many were initially sheltered in emergency centres where authorities struggled with basic needs. Charity workers stepped in where government failed. One survivor family, Belal, his pregnant wife, and 3 children from the 18th floor, were told by a hotel manager to leave after just 2 nights. When their children were released from hospital after spending 3 weeks in comas, another hotel said they couldn't have so many people in one room. Another family spent 18 months in a 1-bedroom hotel room, a mother, father, and 2 children who had lost 5 relatives in the fire. They weren't even provided halal food. The fire burned for 60 hours. When it finally died down, 70 people were dead at the scene. 2 more died in hospitals, bringing the final death toll to 72. Another child was stillborn after the mother escaped. The youngest victim was 6 months old. The oldest was 84. They died from smoke inhalation, from burns, from the impossible choice between staying in burning flats or jumping from windows. This is what a £2 per square metre buys. 72 lives. That's £4,069 per person killed. A rounding error in an £8.7 million refurbishment budget. If you think that's worth remembering, share this video. The aftermath exposed the full depth of systemic failure. The government ordered fire safety tests on similar cladding systems across the UK. Every single combination of polyethylene core ACM with various insulations failed the tests. Not marginally, catastrophically. Flames reached over 7 meters high within 4 minutes. Test observers terminated tests early because the fire spread was so rapid. By November 2019, authorities had identified 446 residential and publicly owned buildings in England, over 18 meters tall, with ACM cladding similar to Grenfell's. None met building regulations. But here's the truly horrifying part. The problem wasn't limited to ACM. As investigations continued, more buildings were found with other combustible materials. By June 2020, approximately 2,000 high-risk buildings over 18 meters had been identified. Another 9,600 high-rises were thought to have combustible cladding, and 100,000 buildings between 11 and 18 meters had unknown status. Remediation has been slow, complicated, expensive. The government initially estimated costs at £600 million. That number has climbed past £10 billion for the social housing sector alone. Private building owners have been left arguing about who pays. Developers, contractors, product manufacturers, building owners, or leaseholders. Meanwhile, people continue living in buildings wrapped in materials known to be dangerous. The Grenfell Tower inquiry, which concluded its hearings in February 2025, produced a 1,700-page final report. The findings were damning. A chain of failures across government and the private sector led to Grenfell Tower becoming a death trap. The inquiry identified multiple entities that bore responsibility: manufacturers who misrepresented their products' fire safety, contractors who prioritized cost over safety, architects who failed to properly specify safe materials, regulators who ignored warnings and failed to update inadequate guidance, building control authorities who didn't properly review designs, and successive governments that had many opportunities between 1991 and 2017 to address the risks of combustible cladding but failed to act. Sir Martin Moore-Bick, the inquiry chair, was particularly critical of what he termed systematic dishonesty by some companies involved in testing and marketing cladding products. Test results were manipulated. Marketing materials misrepresented fire performance. Certifications were obtained through incomplete or misleading tests, and all of this occurred while real fires in other countries demonstrated exactly what would happen if these materials were used on high-rises. The inquiry also highlighted how institutional racism and social class played roles in the disaster. Grenfell Tower housed predominantly working-class residents, many from minority ethnic backgrounds. Their complaints about fire safety before the refurbishment were dismissed or ignored. One resident group, the Grenfell Action Group, had been warning about fire risks since at least 2013. In November 2016, they published a blog post predicting that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord. They were ignored. 7 months later, their prediction came true. Germany had figured this out 40 years ago. After tests in the 1980s showed how combustible cladding behaved in fires, German building regulations restricted plastic-filled panels on tall buildings. France followed suit. The United States implemented stringent testing through NFPA 285 that effectively prohibited polyethylene core ACM on high-rises. But the UK took a different approach. Rather than mandate realistic full-scale testing, British regulations allowed desktop studies and small-scale combustibility tests of individual components. This meant materials could be approved based on how they performed in isolation, not how they actually worked as part of a complete system in real fire conditions. The regulations also relied on guidance documents rather than hard legal requirements. Approved Document B, the key fire safety guidance, was non-mandatory. It used phrases like, adequately resist the spread of flame, without defining what adequate meant. It allowed alternative approaches if they could be justified. And critically, it had been written decades earlier, before modern cladding systems existed. Updates were slow, tentative, and ultimately insufficient. Even after Lacanau House demonstrated the dangers in 2009, with 6 deaths directly linked to external fire spread, the government's response was inadequate. Reviews were commissioned, working groups met, reports were published. But the fundamental regulatory framework remained unchanged. The loopholes stayed open, and more buildings were clad with combustible materials, each one a potential Grenfell waiting for an ignition source. The story of Grenfell Tower is not really about cladding. It's about a regulatory system that prioritized cost over safety, about an industry that put profits before people, about a government that ignored warnings until tragedy forced action, and about the people who paid the price. Families sleeping in their homes, trusting that the building around them was safe. 72 people burned to death or died of smoke inhalation because someone chose Rainobond PE over Rainobond FR to save £2 per square metre, because contractors bid £2.5 million less than the safe alternative, because regulators accepted desktop studies instead of requiring real fire tests, because manufacturers marketed dangerous products without adequately warning buyers, because building control approved designs without understanding the risks, and because government failed to act on decades of warnings. The numbers tell the story of industrial logic defeating common sense. Arconic manufactured and sold polyethylene core ACM panels despite knowing they were dangerous on tall buildings. The company's own marketing materials for continental Europe explicitly stated the PE version should only be used on buildings under 10 meters. For buildings 10 to 30 meters, use the FR version. Above 30 meters, use the non-combustible A2 version. But UK sales staff promoted PE for high-rises anyway, because it was cheaper and UK regulations didn't explicitly prohibit it. Celotex, which manufactured the insulation, had obtained building regulation approval based on tests that didn't reflect how the product would actually be used. They tested their insulation behind non-combustible cladding panels, then marketed it for use with combustible ACM, a system they never actually tested. Kingspan, another insulation manufacturer whose product appeared on parts of Grenfell, similarly obtained approvals based on tests that didn't match real-world applications. The final Grenfell inquiry report contained 58 recommendations aimed at preventing similar disasters. Create a single construction regulator. Require realistic fire testing of complete cladding systems. Make fire safety a legal duty for senior managers. Regulate the term fire engineer so unqualified people can't claim expertise. Review the definition of high-risk buildings beyond just height. Consolidate fire safety responsibilities under one government department. Establish a national college for fire and rescue training. And fundamentally reform how the construction industry operates. Whether these recommendations will be implemented remains to be seen. The government accepted all findings and committed to action. But commitment and implementation are different things. Meanwhile, thousands of people still live in buildings with combustible cladding. They wake up every day in homes that building safety experts consider dangerous. They go to sleep every night trusting that this time government and industry will prioritize their safety. The tower still stands, though it's scheduled for demolition. A memorial is planned for the site, but no memorial can bring back the 72 people who died. No inquiry can undo the failures that killed them. No amount of regulatory reform can erase the knowledge that this disaster was preventable, predictable, and predicted. Germany banned it in the 1980s. France banned it. The United States effectively banned it. The manufacturers knew it was dangerous. Fire safety experts warned it was dangerous. Residents complained their building was unsafe, and UK regulators approved it anyway, because it was cheaper, because the regulations had loopholes, because industry self-certification was trusted, because warnings were ignored, because profit mattered more than people. That's the real lesson of Grenfell Tower. Not that a specific cladding system was dangerous, though it was. Not that specific companies or individuals failed, though they did. The lesson is that systems designed to protect people failed at every level. Regulation failed. Testing failed. Certification failed. Building control failed. Government oversight failed. Corporate responsibility failed. And 72 people died because failure compounded. Failure compounded failure. The fire started with a faulty refrigerator, an accident. But what followed was no accident. It was the inevitable consequence of choices made over years, even decades. Choices to prioritize cost. Choices to trust industry. Choices to delay action, choices to ignore warnings. Every one of those choices had a name attached: a company, a regulator, a government minister, a contractor, an architect, a product manufacturer. 12:54 a.m., June 14th, 2017. A fridge catches fire in flat 16. By 2:43 a.m., the London Fire Brigade logs the last confirmed rescue, 109 minutes. 24 stories, 72 lives. All because someone wrapped sleeping families in material Germany had banned for 40 years. If you believe these failures shouldn't be forgotten, if you think accountability matters, if you want to understand how regulatory systems can fail so catastrophically, subscribe. We need to ensure that never again means something. The Grenfell Tower fire wasn't a disaster. It was a crime. Not in the legal sense, though criminal investigations are ongoing, but in the moral sense. A crime of negligence, a crime of prioritizing profit over safety, a crime of ignoring warnings, a crime of failing people who trusted that their government, their regulators, and their building industry would keep them safe. 72 people are dead. Thousands more live in unsafe buildings. And the systems that failed at Grenfell? Many are still in place, still operating, still making the same calculations about cost versus safety. That's why this story matters, not as history, but as warning. Because somewhere, right now, someone is making a decision to save money on building materials. Someone is choosing not to close a regulatory loophole. Someone is ignoring a warning about building safety. And unless we remember Grenfell, Unless we understand exactly how and why 72 people died, it will happen again. The tower burned for 60 hours. The smoke was visible across London. The images shocked the world. But the real shock should be this. It didn't have to happen. Not any of it. Not one death. 72 people died because polyethylene core ACM panels cost £2 less per square metre than fire-retardant versions. That's the price of human life in a system that values cost savings over safety. Remember that number. £2 per square metre, £4,069 per life. The cost of ignoring warnings, the cost of trusting industry self-certification, the cost of regulatory failure, the cost of choosing profit over people. Grenfell Tower stands as a monument to that choice. And until every building in the UK is made safe, until every regulatory loophole is closed, until every warning is heeded, that monument will continue to ask one simple question. How many more times will we make the same choice? How many more people have to die before we decide that safety matters more than savings? The answer should be 0. After Grenfell, that answer should always be 0.